Greetings, true believers, and welcome to the first episode brought to you by BaggedBoardedAndBoxed.com and the Bill and Frank Eat Pop Culture podcast and YouTube channel. I'm your host of the most, JB, coming to you from the lodge across the bridge from Spidey's hometown of NYC. And just to give you a little bit of background about what we're doing here, this is a vodcast all about comic book trade paperbacks. There's a lot of YouTube videos about comic books out there. Mostly they cover really good comic books. There's other videos out there that love to roast lousy comic books. We'll be doing a little bit of both. I just enjoy good superhero comics, goofy superhero comics, fun superhero comics. A little bit about my background. I'm a big Spider-Man fanboy would be more appropriate. Spidey was the first comic I ever owned, Amazing Spider-Man number 185. If you get a chance to check out the Spidey-tastic Spectacular podcast that I did with Bill and Frank over on the Bill and Frank Eat Pop Culture podcast, you got to hear me talk for about an hour and a half straight about multiple Spider-Man story arcs, my thoughts on Spidey, and why he's my favorite fictional character of all time. And what we're talking about today, this is going to cover what's known as the original Clone Saga. It's on sale for $9.99 on Comixology. It's a lot of goofy Bronze and Modern Age comic books from the mid-70s to the late 80s, many of which only kind of tangentially related to the Clone Saga. It also gives you a good idea of what comics were like in the 70s and how they've changed between the 70s and now. I chose this as the original image to use, one, because it kind of captures the meat of this Clone Saga story, which kind of like it sounds, Spidey gets cloned. It also kind of looks like the meme from the old Spidey cartoon. And speaking of which, I was going to actually do a little vocal instrumental of the intro to the Spidey cartoon. Then I figured maybe I didn't want to torture everybody on our first episode with that. So let's treat it like an MCU teaser. And maybe if you stay till the end, I might regale you with my vocal stylings. Anyway, it kind of reminds me of the meme from that animated series where the two Spider-Men are pointing at each other, which they then lampooned in the post-credit stinger for Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Great cover art. It's a Gil Kane cover. This trade has 22 issues in it. It's 500 pages long. I started reading this immediately after marathoning Stranger Things. It was a pretty good fit for that tonally. Stranger Things obviously lives and dies by its nostalgia, and I was feeling kind of nostalgic for some classic Spider-Man stories. Maybe not this specific Spider-Man story. Then, because it's 500 pages long, obviously I didn't finish it that night. So the next day, I marathoned for the first time in probably 15 years or so, Neon Genesis Evangelion. And suffice to say, the tonal dissonance between Eva and reading goofy Bronze Age Spidey comics is pretty jarring. Eva is basically the anime mecha deconstruction of that genre that Watchmen is of the superhero genre. So it was definitely a little bit of weird to read these after watching that. Nowadays, most comic books have 6-issue story arcs, and that's because most trade paperbacks contain 6 issues if they're talking about a trade of a recent run of issues. So this is actually a real bargain at $9.99 for 22 issues. I guess those old comics are just not something that Marvel's pushing anymore. Back in the day, most storylines only ran, 1 or 2 issues max. Most of the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko run, with a few noticeable exceptions, were actually only single issue arcs. There was a 2-part Doc Ock storyline, I think in 11 and 12. Then there was the 3-parter, the classic If This Be My Destiny, issues 31, 32, 33, also with Doc Ock. And then there was the first Stan Lee, John Romita issues, 39 and 40, with the Green Goblin unmasking Peter Parker. For the most part, a lot of the Stan run was single issues, maybe 2 issues. Stan Lee left Spider-Man with issue number 110. He had Steve Ditko as his primary artist for the first 38 issues, and then John Romita took over. And after issue 110, this guy, Jerry Conway, took over for Stan as the writer. Jerry Conway was something of a wonderkind. He wrote his first comic book story at 16 years old. He was hired on to replace Stan on Amazing Spider-Man, which at the time was Marvel's best-selling book, and regularly is still in the top 10 even now. And he really came out guns blazing. His first, from 110 to 136, he had maybe the seminal 2-issue Spider-Man story arc, the death of Gwen Stacy and the quote-unquote death of the Green Goblin in issues 121 and 122. He had the first appearance of the Punisher. He had the first appearance of Harry Osborn as Green Goblin 2. In the background, he had this new character introduced called the Jackal, who was his take on the Green Goblin, and he's going to be the primary antagonist of this arc. After the Green Goblin 2 introduction, the quality of Conway's work kind of tails off as he enters into these issues, where he focuses more on this clone arc. And as we'll see, there is kind of a overall theme for what he was trying to do, and when we get into some of the specific parts of the story, we'll talk about that. This stuff is not great. It's not terrible. It certainly would not be the first trade paperback I would recommend anybody reading if they want to jump on board with Spider-Man, because it gets kind of convoluted, especially this trade, because as you can see, in addition to the original Spider-Man arc, which is what I originally thought was in this trade, it also includes pretty much every reference to clones prior to the reintroduction of the Clone Saga in the mid-90s. And a lot of these Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man issues are not all that great. And frankly, not all these Amazing Spider-Man issues are that great either. Ross Andrew actually was the primary artist on Amazing Spider-Man for 5 years. I was under the impression that Gil Kane had worked a little longer on Spidey, but Gil Kane did do a lot of the covers for these issues. Some of these covers are just fantastic. I want to flip through some of them. Hopefully, covers on the Marvel website aren't going to get me a copyright strike. I love cover art like this. Back in the 70s, comic book shops didn't really exist. The way you bought comic books was on the newsstand. Mostly it was kids going into 7-Eleven or wherever and spinning through the rack. If they had 25 cents, they might buy Amazing Spider-Man, they might buy something else. So these covers really had to grab a kid to make them want to read these stories. That's why they had Gil Kane and John Romita working on a lot of these covers, really grab the reader and bring him in on the story arcs. This cover is a John Romita one, and it's awesome. So we got Spidey's classic mid-70s Rose Gallery of villains, Jackal on the left, Morbius, Vulture, Mysterio, Doc Ock. There weren't a lot of writers on this initial run. It was Jerry Conway straight through from 139 through 149. And then Archie Goodwin wrote one issue, and Len Wein, who he took over for Roy Thomas as editor, which I think is also part of the reason why Conway's writing went downhill. Roy Thomas was the guy that brought Jerry Conway into Marvel, and then he left, and Len Wein took over as the editor on the Spider-Man line. Jerry Conway didn't last much longer after that. 70s classics here. So this is probably not a panel that you're going to get away with in 2019. Probably wouldn't have blinked an eye at this in 1974 when this comic book came out. One of the things we're kind of be discussing here is presentism. When a historian looks back on history, but they take their own morality into it. I find it's best to avoid that if possible. When you're reading these classic comics, if something's inappropriate for kids, I wouldn't recommend it. For the most part, all these things were designed for kids. While you might have some stuff would probably get on Bleeding Cool if it was published now, having a couple of guys looking like their characters from the Deuce in an issue of Spider-Man, keeping in mind that the way people thought was a little different back in 1974, 1975. Oh, Robbie Robertson, pipe smoker, my hero. I think Joe Quesada introduced a ban on smoking, but kind of places this specifically in a time period. Not a lot of us pipe smokers left, sadly. And then you get the introduction of this incredibly cheesy 1975 villain called the Grizzly. Grizzly is kind of in cahoots with the Jackal, trap Peter Parker. This is a pretty typical arc that you get in the 70s issues, which is no one seeming to be able to figure out that Peter Parker and Spider-Man know each other so well. It's probably because they're the same person. Although the Jackal actually does manage to figure it out. I really like this page. Nowadays, people don't draw buildings anymore because buildings are hard to draw. They use a lot of digital tracing. They'll take an image and they'll turn it into a comic book image in the background. The first time I really remember seeing this was on two different Brian Michael Bendis runs. His Daredevil run in the early aughts and his Alias run with two different artists, Michael Gaidos and Alex Maleev, who both did this. And I remember thinking it was really cool at the time, But now that it's all over the place, it's kind of less interesting. I wanted to show a comparison between how color can really change a comic book image. Here we have a shot of a couple of townhouses on Washington Square. They do a similar shot. They just drenched the image in purples and yellows. It doesn't look as realistic. These colors really love to use this weird pink color, I guess, to make it stand out, but it just kind of like makes everything look like an eyesore, unfortunately. As it turns out, Grizzly was coming after J. Jonah Jameson, and here's the reason why, and it's got to be one of the most ridiculous villain origins of all time. So as it turns out, J. Jonah Jameson went to a wrestling match because apparently that's what publishers and editors of major metropolitan newspapers in the 1970s did. He was he was bored by the violence of this grisly wrestler, so he demanded an investigation in the Daily Bugle. Something tells me that Vince McMahon's WWE is not going to get a front page headline in the New York Post about how violent professional wrestling is. Jerry Conway, he really lost his fastball. And again, just a little reminder that we're in the mid-70s, because there's the Spidey Buggy. Make sure you go out and buy your Spidey Buggy, kids. It's even got a Spidey vanity license tag and has absolutely nothing to do with the story arc of this issue, although I do like that Spidey ends up driving straight past Federal Hall, which was something I used to walk by every day on my way to work. So it's always cool in these Marvel books how they take place in New York City, unlike DC, with Gotham, Metropolis. It makes it feel a little more lived in. It's just kind of one multiverse universe away from ours, and it's not so different in comparison to DC. Oh yeah, I forgot. Spidey also decides that he's hungry, so he's gonna steal this guy's McDonald's dinner, which is super duper not necessarily the best message to send the kids. I kind of think it would have been a funnier bit if they'd actually had Spidey walk into the McDonald's and try to buy dinner. This arc is really all about Gwen and Peter's relationship, all about Gwen and Mary Jane. As you can see from Ross Andrews' artwork, he's very similarly styled to John Romita. Ditko used to draw a really kind of lean Spider-Man. Ross Andrew, Gil Kane kind of come from the John Romita school, where he's a little more of a compact Spidey, kind of like the difference between your Andrew Garfield Spidey, who's a little more long and lean, and your more compact Tobey Maguire or Tom Holland Spider-Man. Ditko obviously is the creator, the originator of the costume and the look and feel. John Romita is my personal favorite Spidey. Him and Todd McFarlane, who again had a completely different style. Most of the Spider-Man artists between Romita and Todd McFarlane would really kind of pull from the Romita style. If you read comics now, for instance, the Brand New Day Spider-Man arc, they had a rotating artist, and it can be a little jarring when you're reading them, 3 or 4 or 5 issues in a row, and you get these major changes in the artwork. So I think hiring artists whose style was pretty close to each other, or hiring artists who were specifically emulating someone else's style, kept the consistency of the books. Look at this art on Aunt May. This is the way you would draw a villain. She doesn't look like a kindly old lady. And he's seeing Gwen Stacy in her classic sort of go-go boots look. He thinks it's a trick, it's just Mysterio's illusions, but obviously, as we're going to find out, this is going to be a recurrence where Peter's going to be seeing visions of his dead ex-girlfriend. Clearly, that is not actually the case. Something else is going on here. Whenever Peter's leaving NYC, Danger, Will Robinson Danger usually means a bad arc, and this 2-issue Cyclone Story Arc is definitely a lousy arc. It does give us this great scene here with Peter and MJ. She's seeing him off in the airport. She gives an explanation for why it is that she calls him Tiger. Look, Tiger, I want you to take real good care of yourself, okay? Sure thing, Mary Jane. If you'll answer one question for me before I leave. One question? Why do you always call me Tiger? Why do I? Oh, Petey, I call you Tiger because you're not. Now come here, Tiger, and kiss me. And I love Robbie Robertson in the background, just enjoying young love. Love this look on MJ here. Mike Allred's also one of my favorite artists. He loves sort of pop art. You can kind of see where a lot of his inspiration comes from in his artwork and sort of the costuming and the colors and styles. Like some of the stuff that was coming out during this era. This is really a great panel. And then we get this cool page where Peter's taking off. He's looking down at the back of the airport. Meanwhile, we got MJ seeing him off. And then as she's leaving, far freaking out. It's something that really like Brian Michael Bendis brought into the mainstream, where he took a 15-page Stan Lee origin story and turned it into 6 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man. I don't mind it when it's used sparingly. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of action in these 2-part arcs that were going on here, but it's kind of nice they took a beat here to give this moment some room to breathe. What I'm getting at here is, obviously this is a Spider-Man book. There's going to be fights, there's going to be costumes, there's going to be crazy heroes and villains, but really this arc is about closure for Peter and his ex-girlfriend, his dead girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, and moving on to who ends up being the love of his life, Mary Jane. We are going to skip all the rest of the Paris stuff because it's terrible. This is the original cover of this trade paperback. Kind of like it better. The color pops a little more. The black background really makes the front stand out. Gives you an idea of what they thought of New York City in the mid-1970s with wine bottles and matchbooks and papers all over the place. Any Spider-Man fans are going to see that one boot and know exactly what's going on in this issue, and I dig that. Oh man, look at this sweater, Peter. That is like, it's a Christmas sweater kind of. I don't even know. Oh my god, it's fantastic though. I kind of want to go to a thrift store and find this thing now. Peter comes home from Paris. He hears that Aunt May is in the hospital. And the reason she's in the hospital is because she also caught a glimpse of good old Gwen Stacy. Good old, supposedly dead, killed by the Green Goblin, Gwen Stacy. How is this possible? The art is really in the classic John Romita version of Gwen Stacy. It was really embodied well by Emma Stone in the Amazing Spider-Man movies as far as the look of the character. Actually, it wasn't too bad in Spider-Man 3 either. Everything else about Spider-Man 3 is a mess, but not necessarily the look and feel of Gwen in that movie either with Bryce Dallas Howard. There's another pretty cool page. It's Spidey talking to Peter, who thinks he's going insane because he's having a vision of Gwen Stacy. Is she really alive and well? Obviously, that's what we got to figure out. Establish here that she was killed by the Green Goblin. And Pete's immediate reaction, again, this is a little bit, would make this character a little bit less likable, probably to a modern reader. Keeping in mind this is written in 1975 is important. Hostile way he reacts to Gwen. Nothing awful, but obviously I think they probably treat this a little differently in 2019. Freaks Gwen out. He's convinced that she's an imposter. How Gwen died. She fell off the Brooklyn Bridge. Pete webbed and thought he caught her, but the sudden stop snapped her neck. So the guilt that Peter feels over Gwen's death is second only to the guilt that he feels about Uncle Ben as far as like what drives him. That whole great power and great responsibility thing is, Spidey's kind of driven by guilt is his major thing. Then Goblin accidentally killed himself. He tried to kill Peter with his sled, and Peter dove out of the way, kind of like the finale of the first Raimi Spider-Man movie. Goblin was impaled and killed. Everybody's gathering around trying to figure out what's going on with Gwen. But Ned's taken some fingerprints, and they match. This is the real Gwen Stacy, but they've also checked the grave, and her body hasn't been touched. So what's going on here? Meanwhile, obviously, the important thing here is Gwen reacting as if she's never died, and meanwhile, obviously, a lot of things have happened in the relationship between Peter and MJ in the meantime. So we get this kind of great shot of Peter looking concerned, MJ looking concerned. Meanwhile, Gwen is obviously just trying to figure out what's going on and how is it that she's come back. The Jackal here is our antagonist. He looks very similar to Green Goblin because he really is very similar to Green Goblin in a lot of ways. This wasn't Conway's greatest creation. Conway and Ross Andrews, Punisher certainly was. But we get a little bit of a riff on Hamlet. So anytime we can bring Shakespeare into it, let's class him up the joint. Mary Jane is super concerned about her relationship with Peter. He hasn't heard from him in a while. Pete is beat. He's exhausted from everything that's happening. Can we do this some other time? But MJ's got to talk about it now, of course. I kind of love this sort of 70s tube top look she's got going here. Boy, oh boy, Pete does not handle this well. Slams door in her face. Just take a break from the storyline. I love this page because there's been so much color in this book, and instead they use the Spidey spotlight to just sort of, and all black around it for this fight with the tarantula. And it adds a lot of tension to the fight scene that we don't get with the rest of the artwork here. I don't think the colorist really did Ross Andrew any great shakes in these issues. And really kind of set off the black and the colors here. I think it really makes the page pop and makes the fight scene much more dramatic. Pete manages to defeat the tarantula, but then he gets surprise attacked by the Jackal. We discover that the Jackal is actually Professor Warren, Peter and Gwen's biology, chemistry teacher. This was supposed to be a big reveal at the time. So Professor Warren had been introduced in Amazing Spider-Man 31, which is the same issue that Gwen Stacy had been, but he hadn't really been a main supporting character until the Jerry Conway arc, where he took this sort of background character that Stan Lee and Ditko had created and brought him more to prominence as a professor at ESU. And if you're kind of savvy and you're an adult reading this, you probably could figure out that Professor Warren was not all that he seemed to be, because that Chekhov's gun, give a character a purpose. So back in the 90s, this was the toughest issue to get, because this was the first appearance of the clone. So technically the first appearance of Ben Reilly, which is probably not actually as hard to get now, although any classic comic from the 70s, there's just less and less of them around every year. I do remember trying to track this down, and it was not easy to do. You get the origin story of the Jackal here, after he's kind of beaten Peter up. He hates him because he loved Gwen Stacy. Kind of really inappropriate. 18, 19-year-old college co-ed, and this elderly, white-haired, mustachioed professor fell in love with her. He decides he blames Peter Parker and Spider-Man for her death. He happened to have a sample for when they took samples in class, and he uses this sample. He and his assistant have figured out how to clone things. He's actually made 2 clones. One of Gwen Stacy. He decides he's going to become the Jackal to avenge her. He also wants to resurrect the love of his life, supposedly. Obviously, this is a pretty twisted dude. He uses hypnosis to control her, and that's why she's following his orders. And this is where it's important. From here, where he gets injected onward, we, the reader, and Spider-Man, the character, no longer know which one is the Peter Parker that's been around in 2 years of comic books and several months of in-comic continuity anymore. And this is the kernel of the idea that's going to lead to the major Clone Saga in the 1990s. They wake up, they say the same thing because they're the same person. That's very important to remember also, is the clone has all of Peter's memories up to this point, where they're sort of like an alternate timeline and their paths diverge right at this point. But up until this moment, they are exactly the same person. Meanwhile, the Jackal has this explosive ready to go off. At the last minute, he realizes that he doesn't want to be a murderer, so he saves Ned's life. The Jackal is crushed. Ned is saved, as is either Peter or the clone, but one of the other Spider-Men is not. He dies. The Gwen clone is okay, but Peter realizes, the other me? He's gone, Gwen. But are you sure that you're... Oh, I'm the real one, Gwen, believe me. But how can you tell? Simple. Far out. So Peter doesn't know if he's a clone or not. And this is the kernel of the idea that's really going to bring about the Clone Saga in the 1990s. Pete takes the Gwen clone to the gravesite of Gwen original flavor, and Gwen clone decides that she's going to move on. MJ's waiting for Peter when he gets back, and this is kind of giving him the closure that he needed to move on from his relationship with Gwen to his relationship with MJ. And again, that really was kind of the point of this whole arc. Spidey is always about the personal as much as it is anything else, but we do have some house cleaning to do, which is Peter's got to figure out whether or not he's the clone. We've now moved away from Jerry Conway. Archie Goodwin takes over for an issue, and then Len Wein takes over in issue 151. Peter goes to Dr. Curtis Connors, also known as the Lizard, for some lab tests to figure out whether he's the clone or not, but he's got to wait for the results. Meanwhile, he gets into battle with several of his villains. This is like your kind of standard Bronze Age 150th issue. They got to throw everything at the right at the moment of his death against a Spider Slayer. The one person he sees is MJ, and he says to himself, "Mary Jane took me so long to finally realize that she's the one I care for. Professor Warren's clone might remember the same thing, But my thinking of it now is pure emotional response, one the clone couldn't have. Most emotional responses are learned from outside stimuli. Basically, he's saying that because the clone was created from a template after Gwen died, but before Peter fell in love with MJ, the clone can't possibly be the real Peter. So he decides he doesn't even need the lab results. He webs them from Dr. Connor's desk. He tears them up, throws them away, because he already knows the answer that he is not the clone. And for 20 years after this, that's what we all thought. He does have to dispose of the body, which again is kind of like not a really cool sort of Spider-Man thing to do. As far as any of us knew, this here was the last we were ever going to see of this clone, or so we thought until 1994 when they decided to bring it back. This trade also includes pretty much every subsequent reference to the clones. There's a multi-issue Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man arc, that also happens to have this guy, Frank Miller, drawing Daredevil. And this comic, I think, came out in 1978 or 1979, so prior to Miller's run on Daredevil. The artwork is definitely not as good as the subsequent run. It's just, again, giving you some padding here. Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, was never really the kind of prime Spidey book. If I get the chance, it's like 11 more trades, and they're all super long, and the Clone Saga was the first thing that kind of drove me away from reading Spider-Man comics. I'll try to pepper in some newer stuff, some different issues, but I might, I have all those downloaded. I might, read and review those as well. Like what was going on with Spidey in the 90s, why the Clone Saga happened, why it went off the rails as badly as it did, why they had to do so much work to kind of fix everything with Spidey with the issues that came about in the late 90s and early aughts. Would I recommend this? Probably not. If I were recommending somebody start out with Spider-Man, like I said in the Spidey-tastic Spectacular podcast, I'd recommend either they start with Amazing Fantasy 15. If for whatever reason someone's having some trouble, they just feel like it's super dated, you could always start with Ultimate Spider-Man. This would not be the trade I would start out with. It just happened to be the thing I was kind of interested in reading and decided to run a review on. It's fun, goofy Bronze Age stuff. And my review would probably be, maybe a 50 out of 100. And this one happens to be the cover of Amazing Spider-Man 185, the first Spidey comic I ever owned. Feel free to tell me what you think. If there's a trade paperback you think you want to recommend to me, you think that you'd like for me to review, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on the YouTube video. Leave a comment on baggedboardedandboxed.com. Make sure that you subscribe to the Bill and Frank Eat Pop Culture Podcast YouTube channel. Hit the bell for notifications, so anytime a new video is put up, you can see it. They put their podcast up there. Frank puts his pull list up there. I'll be putting my comic book trade paperback corner reviews up there. Here's our little stinger. Spider-Man, Spider-Man.